Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking on just a monumental stack of sources. We've got clinical psychology journals, global economic reports,
A lot to get through.
a lot. And we're going to immerse ourselves in this really complex and often pretty devastating interconnected world of societal homophobia, internalized stigma, identity, and, the mental health outcomes that result from all of it within the LGBTQIA+ community.
Yeah, and this is so much more than just a surface level issue of, say, tolerance. It's really a deep exploration into psychological injury.
Right.
We're not just looking at how external prejudice shows up. We're looking at how those pervasive negative cultural messages get absorbed, metabolized, and ultimately turned inward.
So they fundamentally challenge a person's very identity and sense of self.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to go deep. We really need to move past the simple definitions to get at the complex psychological roots of anti-gay prejudice. We want to know the why. Why do people cling to these beliefs? And then, crucially, we want to assess the heavy, measurable, emotional, and economic cost of internalizing all of it.
Yeah.
We're going to be connecting the dots between, individual therapy sessions, campus life surveys, and these staggering global financial losses.
And I think we have to start right in the middle of a really crucial and challenging academic debate. It's one that really dictates how we even approach intervention. The central hook here is the controversy around the term internalized homophobia itself.
Yes. Okay. This is a term that's become, pretty common shorthand,
Right.
Especially in advocacy and clinical work.
Mm-hmm.
But some theorists are saying, hang on, we need to rethink this. Why?
Well, while the concept itself really resonates, it describes that felt experience of shame and self-hatred so well.
Yeah.
Critical theorists argue it's often used, well, uncritically. The concern is really about the sociopolitical consequence. They worry that by focusing all the attention and all the effort on the individual,
Uh-huh.
the term unfairly repathologizes the sick lesbian or gay individual.
So instead of demanding that the system, the institutionalized system change, we're basically telling the individual victim that their shame is a phobia that they have to overcome.
That they have to fix in therapy, yes. It shifts the burden of correction completely onto the marginalized person.
Right.
It lets society off the hook. It lets us all look away from institutionalized heterosexism, which is the real structural cause of all the negative messaging in the first place.
Okay.
Now, don't get me wrong, the concept has a valuable role in mental health work, but we have to acknowledge that if we just apply it uncritically, we risk individualizing what is at its core a collective social and political problem.
That is a really powerful point.
Hmm.
So any effective path forward has to balance the necessary individual psychological work, the healing, with the clear need for collective social action.
Civil rights, protections, all of it.
Yeah, exactly. So if the academic and activist worlds are sort of fighting over whether the term itself puts the burden on the victim, let's start by clarifying what those negative forces are on the outside. Let's start with the broadest terminology.
Okay, so we begin with the foundational external pressure, homophobia. It's defined, pretty simply as anxiety, aversion, and discomfort regarding LGBT people or their behavior. It's an emotional reaction, a fear, an avoidance, a kind of visceral negative response.
But that emotional aversion, homophobia, it doesn't just appear out of thin air. It's supported by this massive cultural infrastructure.
It is.
And that brings us to the more technical terms, which are heteronormativity and heterosexism.
Right. So heteronormativity is that deep cultural assumption, and it's often totally unconscious, that heterosexuality is the only normal, natural, or acceptable sexual orientation.
It's the background noise.
It is the background noise of society. And if heteronormativity is the assumption, then heterosexism is like the enforcement mechanism. It's when that belief gets normalized and enforced through social structures, institutions, and daily practices.
So, okay, if heteronormativity is the air we breathe, the unspoken rule that, most TV shows, greeting cards, history books all follow,
Right.
then heterosexism is the specific infrastructure built on the assumption that only heterosexual lungs can operate in that air.
That is a perfect analogy.
So it's the denial of marriage licenses, or the lack of housing protection, or, the medical forms that only have a box for mother and father.
That's it. That systematic institutional enforcement creates a climate where any other sexual orientation is automatically devalued. And that fosters injustice and often just a denial of basic recognition.
And this devaluation, this is what drives stigma. The sources define stigma not as just one thing, but as like the co-occurrence of 5 distinct elements all working together in a context where power is being exercised.
Right. And those 5 elements are labeling, which is designating a group as different, stereotyping, applying negative general traits to that group, separation, creating that us versus them boundary, status loss, which is reducing the social standing of the labeled group, and then finally discrimination, which is just unequal treatment.
And that discrimination it can be loud or it can be really quiet.
Precisely. It can be overt, which we call enacted stigma, so explicit violence, hate crimes, workplace discrimination,
The stuff you see.
the stuff you see. Or it can be covert and subtle, things like policy statements or cultural norms that perpetuate anti-LGBT prejudice while, maybe claiming to be neutral. Both forms impose this immense psychological burden.
So if that's the external pressure, let's now look at the mechanism. How does that pressure become self-inflicted damage? The shift from external stigma to internalized stigma, or as it's called, internalized homonegativity.
Yeah, IH, this is the direct psychological consequence. It's this complex process where sexual minorities integrate all those societal stereotypes and the oppression they feel into their own self-concepts.
So the person literally absorbs the cultural condemnation.
They do. The idea that their identity is wrong or deviant or abnormal, and this leads to these intense internal conflicts, a negative self-valuation, and eventually you can actually measure the deterioration in their mental health. It's self-loathing, but it's rooted in external messaging.
And what's particularly insidious is how that external prejudice has evolved.
Yeah.
It's not always, blatant, aggressive hatred anymore. We're now dealing with something much more slippery.
Yes, modern homonegativity.
Right.
Modern homonegativity maintains prejudice by being masked or hidden, often because, open slurs are now socially or legally unacceptable. So it lets people feel and act in a prejudicial way without explicitly admitting they're intolerant.
So they get to preserve a non-prejudiced self-image.
They do, and it shows up through 3 main discourses that sound pretty benign, but are fundamentally resistant to equality.
Okay, let's break those 3 down, because I think you hear these everywhere.
The first one is that LGBT people require non-essential social change. This implies that the systems, housing, jobs, marriage laws, they're all perfectly fine. And the demands for equality, like, being featured in mainstream media or having inclusive bathrooms, are trivial or just overblown.
It's the you already have enough rights, stop complaining argument.
That's the one, which effectively denies the current reality of ongoing systemic minority stress.
Of course.
Which ties right into the second discourse. Prejudice and discrimination are a thing of the past.
Ugh, yeah.
This actively denies the current reality. It says, why are you still talking about homophobia? We legalized gay marriage. That problem is solved. And this allows the speaker to dismiss any current reports of discrimination as just individual, isolated incidents.
Instead of a systemic climate.
Exactly.
And that third one is, it's the ultimate form of victim blaming.
It is. The third discourse argues that LGBT individuals put too much emphasis on their sexuality and are therefore responsible for their own marginalization.
Oh, wow.
The implication is, if you would just be less visible, if you would just stop talking about being gay, you'd be fine. It weaponizes the need for visibility against the very people who are seeking equality.
If you look at it cynically, it's a genius strategic form of intolerance. It allows someone to declare, I'm not homophobic, while at the same time resisting any meaningful change that would actually lead to true equality.
Precisely.
And that bridges us perfectly into the next section.
Yeah.
If prejudice is so often hidden or irrational, what deeper psychological needs is it fulfilling for the person holding it?
That's the million-dollar question. If homophobia isn't always rational, if it's not based on objective data or logic, then we have to examine the deeper psychological engine driving it. Why does anti-gay prejudice exist in the first place?
Okay, let's start with the classic psychoanalytic perspective, the psychodynamic engine of homophobia. This theory suggests that prejudice serves a really specialized kind of defensive function for the prejudiced person.
Right.
It reduces tension that's aroused by their own internal unconscious conflicts.
And the mechanism is classic projection. The individual sees some kind of analogy between gay or lesbian people and their own unacceptable urges or their own deeply repressed thoughts or inner turmoil.
And so they externalize these conflicts.
They externalize them and reject the symbol of those urges, which is the gay or lesbian person. And this allows them to avoid consciously recognizing those specific urges as their own.
So the anxiety isn't actually about the person standing in front of them. It's about the threat that person poses to the integrity of their own defenses. Contact with a homosexual person then inevitably arouses anxiety because it threatens to bring up these repressed thoughts.
That is the essence of it. And historical theories get even more specific about what exactly is being repressed or projected. For heterosexual men, hostility might come from an unconscious envy of gay men's presumed freedom from the really restrictive, often rigid ideals of traditional masculinity.
So the ability to express emotion or enjoy certain aesthetics
Or just engage in non-conforming social roles. That envy of a perceived freedom is just too threatening to acknowledge consciously, so it gets translated into aggressive hostility.
there were other theories that focus on rejection.
Yes, another view suggests negative feelings toward opposite sex. Homosexual individuals come from heterosexuals' feelings of being rejected as potential sexual partners, which is less about identity and more about a perceived sexual threat.
Right.
And then there was this more profound, though ultimately flawed, hypothesis rooted in mortality anxiety. The idea was that since many people strive for vicarious immortality through having children, and because gay and lesbian individuals were incorrectly seen as rejecting this way of cheating death, they evoked an unconscious fear of mortality in heterosexual observers.
It's interesting how much time the sources spend connecting this engine of anxiety directly to gender identity, especially for men, which leads to this highly influential theory of masculinity as homophobia.
This is a critical psychological and sociological deep dive. Michael Kimmel's theory defines manhood not as some, innate biological thing, but as a dynamic, constantly changing, socially constructed collection of meanings.
And often, that construction is fundamentally defensive. Can you elaborate on what makes it defensive?
Well, developmentally, traditional masculinity is often defined as the flight from the feminine or the aggressive repudiation of the mother. The young boy suppresses and rejects traits associated with his primary caregiver like nurturance, compassion, tenderness, emotional vulnerability,
Because expressing them would reveal his incomplete separation from her.
and label him as weak or a sissy. The crucial takeaway here is that masculine identity is fundamentally born in the renunciation of the feminine, not in the direct, confident affirmation of a trait.
Which makes the resulting identity inherently unstable.
Exactly. It makes it tenuous and fragile. Because it's a negative definition, it's what you are not.
Yeah.
It has to be constantly defended and policed.
Wow.
And so homophobia is then described not primarily as a fear of women or a fear of femininity, but as men's fear of other men. It serves as the policing mechanism of the gender border.
The greatest fear is being exposed by other men as unmanly or emasculated, often by being labeled gay.
That fear is the animating condition of the dominant definition of masculinity.
It's the anxiety that someone else is going to call your bluff, that they're going to expose the fragility of your performance of manhood.
And this framework really helps clarify a major paradox the sources talk about. Why do men hold virtually all the societal power, yet individually they often do not feel powerful?
It seems like only a tiny fraction of men truly inhabit that dominant definition of masculinity.
That's right. The sources argue that we've constructed the rules of manhood so narrowly and rigidly that only a tiny fraction of men feel like they are the biggest of wheels. The overwhelming majority of men are disempowered by other means, be it race, class, socioeconomic status, sexual preference.
So homophobia, along with sexism and racism, becomes a readily available tactic.
A tactic to exclude perceived competitors or threats from the defined male group. And that helps the powerful maintain their advantage, and it offers the less powerful a kind of false sense of inclusion in the real man club. It is a tool for hierarchical maintenance, not just personal belief.
Wow, that reframes it completely. It's not just prejudice, it's a structural tool for power maintenance and shame displacement. Okay, let's move from these psychodynamic theories to a more modern, almost evolutionary perspective. Coalitional psychology and aggressive homophobia. This one focuses heavily on aggression toward gay men specifically.
This is a really surprising finding, and it's rooted in group defense strategy. This theory hypothesized that homosexual males might be seen as defectors from collective group defense strategies.
Defectors.
Yeah. In ancestral contexts, group safety relied heavily on the commitment of all male members to the fight against external threats. So aggressive homophobia, that propensity to feel anger and express aggression, may correlate with an implicit association of gay men with surrender or defection from the group's defense.
So it's not simply that gay men are different, it's that They are subconsciously perceived as compromising the physical safety or readiness of the group in a time of conflict.
They're seen as unreliable allies.
That's the defector hypothesis.
It is. And research testing this found that aggressive homophobia correlated positively with the tendency to implicitly associate the concept of gay with the concept of surrender. This suggests the emotion isn't necessarily disgust, which often leads to avoidance, but anger, which leads to punishment.
And the data actually supports this punitive response.
Absolutely. The study found that individuals with a greater commitment to group defense displayed significantly more punishing attitudes toward gay men.
How did they test that?
They even used a vignette experiment. They compared the decision to punish a homosexual man who committed a theft versus punishing a heterosexual man who committed the exact same theft. And commitment to group defense was positively and more strongly correlated with the decision to punish the homosexual man.
Wow.
So the perceived cost of defection, the betrayal of the group, is the powerful driver here. It often overrides the simple transgression itself.
That is a truly insightful takeaway that for some people, the anger directed at gay men is rooted in this ancient psychological trigger for group loyalty and defense, not just simple social distaste.
Right. And moving to the final piece of the prejudice puzzle, we have to talk about personality and moral justification, because people often need a rationale or at least a temporary suspension of conscience to act out this prejudice.
And research consistently links specific personality traits to less tolerant behavior.
Yes. The Big Five personality model is really instructive here. Low scores in agreeableness, which is associated with being compassionate, cooperative, and kind, and low scores in openness to experiences.
Curiosity, imagination.
Right, a willingness to try new things. Those two reliably predict less tolerant behavior toward LGBT individuals. If you're naturally less agreeable and more resistant to change or novelty, you are statistically more likely to perpetuate intolerance.
And when that prejudice turns into harmful action or policy, it relies on a specific cognitive mechanism, which is moral disengagement. How did that deactivation work?
Moral disengagement is a concept from Albert Bandura. It describes the mental gymnastics required to temporarily deactivate one's moral self-control system so they can justify performing harmful actions towards sexual minorities without feeling, undue guilt or scruples. It works through several interconnected routes.
Could you give us an example of those routes?
Sure. One route is euphemistic labeling. So instead of calling harassment cruelty, it's labeled as just joking or teasing. Another is displacement of responsibility. I didn't do it. The group made me do it. Or I'm just following the rules of the institution.
Right.
A third is dehumanization, seeing the target group as less than human and therefore outside the bounds of moral consideration.
So it's making the violation seem acceptable by sanitizing the language and minimizing the consequences.
Exactly. And the analysis of this mechanism is highly significant in the context of homophobia. In one study, moral disengagement explained over 30% of the variance in responses related to personal discomfort and institutional homophobia.
Over 30%. That's huge.
It's a massive level of predictive power. It shows how crucial this cognitive process is in maintaining negative attitudes in a society that is, ostensibly becoming more tolerant.
So understanding how people check out of their own moral system is key to designing interventions. It's the loophole they use.
It is.
Okay, so now we shift from the cause, the psychodynamic envy, the policing of masculinity, the coalitional punishment, to the effect. What happens when these messages are successfully integrated into the self-concept?
What happens with internalized homonegativity?
Right. The empirical data linking IH directly to negative mental health outcomes it's stark. These are not abstract concepts. They are measurable psychological injuries.
The research synthesizes just clear and troubling associations across large sample sizes. Internalized homophobia is associated with significantly lower self-esteem, a strong negative correlation there. It reliably predicts higher depression. It correlates with a lower stability of self.
Meaning a person's sense of who they are feels constantly shifting or threatened.
That's right.
And what's the most predictive negative outcome?
The strongest association we found was with increased loneliness, a correlation of 0.62. That is highly significant. The internalization of stigma is profoundly isolating. This also connects to associations between social anxiety in sexual minorities and increased sexual risk behavior, suggesting that anxiety and poor coping can lead to, maladaptive behaviors.
Wait, can we pause on that? Loneliness is the highest correlation cited, significantly more predictive than depression or low self-esteem. Why is the internalization of stigma so incredibly isolating?
It's a great question. It's because when you absorb the cultural message that a core part of your identity, your love, your desires, is wrong or unacceptable, you create a self-imposed barrier to intimacy.
Ah.
So even if you're surrounded by supportive people, you maintain a psychological distance because you fear they might discover the unacceptable part of you. The internal conflict prevents the deep, honest communication that's required for true connection.
And this inherent difficulty with connection brings us directly to the profound impact on relationship health.
Yeah, the research focusing on sexual satisfaction in gay men really illustrates this. Internalized homonegativity acts as a negative self-schema, a way of seeing oneself as flawed, and this impacts intimacy through two distinct routes.
The first being the direct route.
Yes, there is a direct effect in reducing sexual satisfaction. If you carry shame about your sexuality, it's just difficult to fully embrace pleasure or authentic desire. But there are also significant indirect effects.
Yeah.
Internalized homonegativity impairs identity resilience.
The ability to bounce back from stigma.
Right, and it undermines essential sexual communication skills.
So the internalization doesn't just make you feel bad about yourself in bed. It fundamentally hinders your ability to build and sustain a healthy, satisfying, intimate relationship because you lack the core skills to communicate your needs and desires honestly.
Precisely. If we want to enhance sexual satisfaction in gay men, therapeutic interventions need to target IH management and actively promote the development of identity resilience and sexual communication skills, rather than just focusing on, surface-level relational conflicts.
This whole discussion of shame and sexuality leads to the difficult challenge of measurement. If these negative schemas are so deep-seated, how do we distinguish between what people consciously say they believe and what they unconsciously feel?
The distinction between implicit and explicit attitudes, it's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
Measuring internalized stigma is notoriously complicated because explicit attitudes, what you report on a questionnaire, are often weakly related to implicit attitudes, the deep automatic associations held in the subconscious.
So researchers developed a specific tool for this.
They did. It's called the internal SOSAMP. It's a mouthful, but it's designed to assess this implicit internalized stigma among queer people.
And the finding was that the correlation between what people said explicitly and what they felt implicitly was surprisingly weak.
Very weak. The correlation was tiny, which means someone can genuinely believe and explicitly state, I accept my identity and I'm fine with being queer, while their gut reaction, their subconscious data, is screaming the opposite.
Wow.
We're talking about a conflict that runs deeper than the conscious mind can easily access or resolve. This complicates both research and therapy because it confirms that these are two distinct yet weakly related parts of the self.
So the therapist is battling a shadow self, a part of the client that the client might not even know exists, which makes those conscious affirmations feel hollow.
Exactly. And on top of that, early measures of internalized stigma were largely developed for cisgender gay men. But we now know there are unique stressors and stereotypes that apply to lesbian women, bisexual men, and transgender individuals. Nuanced measurement is absolutely vital.
Okay, moving to a more hopeful note, let's explore protective buffers, specifically the surprising role of couplehood and parenthood. The study from Israel offers a really unique cultural context for this data, which seems necessary to understand the findings.
The Israeli context is crucial. It's a society with exceptionally strong familial and pronatalist values. It has one of the highest fertility rates in the Western world. So achieving parenthood and couplehood is a primary, highly validated path for social acceptance and inclusion there, regardless of your sexual orientation.
And the study compared LGBT individuals who were parents or in a committed relationship versus those who were single and non-parents.
And the results were powerfully positive for those who achieved those milestones. They reported significantly lower levels of internalized homonegativity, lower depressive symptoms, and higher life satisfaction. The act of forming a family and coupling up offered a shield.
But the key insight is how that shield works. It's an indirect effect, right?
Yes. Couplehood and parenthood don't just magically make you happier. They exert their beneficial effect on mental health by decreasing the levels of internalized homonegativity.
So achieving these highly valued, socially validated life goals, having a family, having a stable partner, acts as this powerful external validation against the negative societal messages.
It essentially gives the individual tangible proof that their life is valid, valuable, and normal, directly combating that internal critic.
That speaks volumes about the power of social inclusion and validation. We'll come back to the paradox this presents at the very end, but first, let's turn to the daily realities of negotiating identity in hostile environments.
The fight for acceptance is rarely a quiet one. It requires constant negotiation and self-censorship, starting with that lifelong tension point, the coming out dilemma.
Right. Coming out is rightly celebrated as an affirmation of identity, but the sources remind us it is also consistently identified as a major source of stress. The risks involved are very real and very significant.
The risks associated with disclosure are tangible. They range from family crisis, being dismissed from the household, to job loss, and just severe ostracism from peers or religious communities. But the alternative, remaining closeted, is equally costly, if not more damaging over the long term.
The psychic cost of living a double life.
Exactly. Remaining closeted forces LGB individuals to maintain significant personal, emotional, and social distance from the people they're hiding from.
Yeah.
They have to constantly monitor their language, their appearance, their companions, their stories, just to protect the secrecy of their core identity.
It must be exhausting.
It is professionally and personally exhausting. It results in this pervasive sense of inauthenticity and hypervigilance.
And how does this play out in the professional sphere, in the workplace?
We see a clear paradox here. Research suggests that LGB individuals who are more open at work report significantly higher levels of job satisfaction and commitment. They feel honest, empowered, and connected.
That's the psychological reward of authenticity.
It is. However, that openness comes with huge risks.
And the sources quantify this fear.
They do. More than two-thirds of lesbian and gay individuals surveyed believed disclosure would create problems, and a third believed it would specifically hurt their career progression, increasing the risk of not being hired or promoted. And the stark reality is that in many places there is little to no legal protection, which means that fear of harassment keeps the majority closeted, sacrificing satisfaction for safety.
This systematic institutional failure is also starkly demonstrated in higher education, a place that you'd assume would be a bastion of progressive thought.
Yeah, you'd think so. But qualitative studies confirm that despite progressive legal settings or liberal campus cultures, homophobia remains highly prevalent in higher education institutions. It's often not some big protest, it's the death by 1,000 cuts.
What are some specific examples the research highlights regarding the psychological toll on students?
The examples are just heartbreakingly concrete. Students reported skipping classes or even dropping courses because of persistent homophobic jokes made by lecturers or because they felt a particular professor held a bias against them.
Wow.
Other students had to change residences or dormitories because they just could not tolerate the peer treatment in their allocated housing. The institutional tolerance of these micro and macroaggressions directly affects students' academic performance, their campus life, and their mental well-being, forcing them to modify their behavior or leave a setting entirely.
So when you're facing this level of systemic and environmental opposition, individuals naturally develop these highly sophisticated psychological coping mechanisms. These are the internal defense strategies you use to manage that overwhelming anxiety.
We can categorize several key defense mechanisms. First, the more primitive ones: denial and suppression.
Denial being the refusal to acknowledge the painful reality.
Exactly. Denial is refusing to acknowledge a sexual identity that's different from the mainstream, and it often stems from growing up in cultural environments that deem homosexuality a taboo. Suppression is related, but it's a more conscious process, the active postponement of conflict or discomfort.
So deliberately pushing unwanted thoughts and emotions out of awareness.
Right. Often with the intent to address them later.
And then, moving up the maturity ladder of defense mechanisms, there's sublimation.
Sublimation is considered a sign of psychological maturity. It involves channeling those taboo feelings or the unacceptable urges or just the emotional energy generated by conflict into creative, positive, and socially acceptable behaviors.
So the sources suggest that LGBTQIA+ students are more likely to channel these suppressed anxieties into creative endeavors.
They do. Research suggests that those who experience sexual problems related to anxieties over taboo desires are often the ones who report greater creative accomplishments.
So the pressure picker of internalized shame gets redirected and harnessed for artistic or academic production. The conflict becomes the fuel.
Yes. And finally, there's simple avoidance. This involves managing uncomfortable situations to reduce anxiety, like avoiding disclosing your identity to family, or in extreme cases, choosing to marry heterosexually because the reality of fully accepting your identity and facing the consequences is just too intimidating.
That is a profound spectrum of self-management. But beyond individual coping, some people engage in a form of collective coping called system justification. The Brazilian study on this sounds completely counterintuitive. Why would a marginalized person rationalize and legitimize the very system that marginalizes them?
It is the ultimate paradox of social psychology. The study found that justifying the heteronormative system, believing the system is fair, just, and necessary, can be psychologically beneficial if the individual does not internalize the stigma.
Okay, so
In essence, believing the system is fair and stable can provide psychological comfort and a sense of stability. It's a false comfort, but it reduces cognitive dissonance.
but if they do internalize the stigma, then justifying the system becomes devastating.
Precisely. If you already believe you are wrong and you also believe the system that deems you wrong is fair, then the harm to your well-being is compounded. It confirms your unworthiness. So false comfort is better than none, but only if you haven't swallowed the poison of internalized shame.
This is where group identity comes in. What role does in-group identification play in this process?
A huge one. Strong identification with the LGB group decreases the psychological benefit of justifying the existing system. The researchers call this the mitigating role of LGB identification on the palliative effect. If you identify strongly with your community, you are aware of the collective group struggle, the institutional barriers, the history of oppression.
So group identity makes you politically aware, and that political awareness protects you from accepting the false comfort of claiming the system is fair.
You prioritize collective reality over personal psychological stability.
That's it. If you identify strongly with the group, you know the system is fundamentally unfair, and therefore you cannot rationalize its fairness to maintain your own sense of stability. It keeps the political focus external.
It's a form of protective radicalization in a way.
And it's important to note the subgroup difference in this complex finding. The mediating role of IH was significant for gay men, but not for lesbian women or bisexual men and women.
Which just highlights that the structure of perceived identity threat and the coping strategies that result differ significantly depending on your specific minority identity.
Okay, as we transition toward practical solutions and intervention strategies, we have to first address the gatekeepers of mental health, therapists and counselors. And that means taking a deep look at affirmative clinical practice.
Yes.
The sources reveal just an astonishing finding about a therapist's personal feelings about homosexuality and their perceived professional effectiveness. It's not just about knowledge.
This is perhaps one of the most critical clinical findings in our whole stack. Research confirmed that a therapist's own level of homophobia, measured by tools like the Modern Homophobia Scale, significantly predicts their self-reported clinical competency with LG clients.
Okay, but here's the massive finding.
Here it is. A therapist's homophobia mediates the relationship between their specialized knowledge and their actual skills.
That finding just upends traditional clinical training models. It means you can't just mandate a seminar on LGBTQIA plus topics and assume competence has been achieved. Knowledge alone is not enough to produce ethical, effective care.
It provides empirical support that teaching therapists about identity development models or the coming out process is necessary, but it is utterly insufficient. The training has to actively focus on the clinician's internal landscape.
So to truly increase skills and provide ethical care, therapists have to actively confront, explore, and resolve their own homophobic and heterosexist beliefs first.
They must. If the therapist is unconsciously carrying the same societal poison the client is trying to shed, the therapy room becomes part of the problem, not the solution. Therefore, affirmative counseling goals should focus on 3 crucial steps. First, modeling positive reactions for the client. Second, helping the client externalize homophobia, teaching them this is society's problem, not a personal flaw. And third, promoting self-acceptance and celebrating identity integrity.
Beyond the clinical setting, societal change depends on reducing societal prejudice. The data here reinforces the power of a surprisingly old, reliable hypothesis.
The contact hypothesis. It remains the most influential factor. Personal contact is the most consistent variable in reducing prejudice. But the research gets really specific about what kind of contact works best, which is the key insight.
It's not just general exposure, is it?
No, the most effective contact is highly intimate and specific. Conversations with homosexual peers, like a best friend, a close neighbor, a school acquaintance, have the biggest impact.
So intimate social networks and relationships where the stakes are high matter more than just general exposure.
They do. These deep connections force the non-LGB person to confront the humanity and complexity of the stigmatized identity.
And what about targeted interventions? Can we reduce prejudice by tapping into basic human emotional circuits like empathy?
The empathy strategy proves to be moderately effective. Evoking empathy towards a member of a stigmatized group, for instance, asking a participant to read a detailed story about a gay college student who experienced overt discrimination was moderately successful at reducing both implicit and explicit anti-gay prejudice.
So shifting focus from the issue to the person can be a valuable tool.
A very valuable, replicable tool for reducing bias.
Finally, we need to take this deeply personal, psychological, and sociological issue and scale it up to the massive macroeconomic level. What is the global economic impact of allowing homophobia to persist?
This is where we provide the ultimate so what. Homophobia is not merely a social justice issue or a mental health concern. It is a measurable economic cost worldwide that drains national treasuries.
Okay.
The prejudice against gay people has been estimated to have a global economic cost of an absolutely staggering $119.1 billion.
That forces every finance minister in the world to pay attention. Let's break down exactly how a social prejudice translates into such a material loss.
The cost stems from several factors, primarily decreased productivity, lower wages, violence resulting in time off work, and significantly increased health costs. In countries where homophobia is high, the cost of treating mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and suicide risk related to minority stress is just immense. We also see higher rates of HIV transmission and less effective treatment due to shame and secrecy.
Can we look at some specific nation examples?
Absolutely. In India, for example, the estimated loss due to health costs, violence, and lower productivity was up to 1.7% of GDP.
1.7%.
Nigeria's estimated economic loss is about 1% of its GDP. When you scale that continentally, the money loss is astronomical. Asia's estimated loss was $88.29 billion. The Middle East and North Africa, $16.92 billion.
And the reverse is powerfully true. Inclusion correlates directly with robust economic health.
There's a clear positive correlation between LGBTQ inclusion, so that's both legal rights and social acceptance, and higher GDP per capita. One study found that a 1-point increase in the Global Acceptance Index correlated with an increase of over $1,500 in GDP per capita. And even more surprising, one additional legal right, like non-discrimination in employment, was correlated with an increase of almost $1,700 in GDP per capita.
Wait, the legal rights aspect actually showed a slightly bigger influence than acceptance alone.
That's a fascinating nuance. While acceptance and legal rights strongly reinforce each other, the presence of enforceable legal protections appears to provide a slightly stronger, more immediate, and tangible economic boost than social acceptance alone. Inclusion is not just the right thing to do socially and ethically. It is demonstrably and quantitatively beneficial for the entire economic system. It offers a huge return on investment.
So this deep dive has shown us that the forces we call homophobia are just incredibly complex. They're rooted in everything from the fragile construction of masculine gender identity in ancient coalitional psychology to explicit legislative barriers and subtle modern forms of institutional apathy.
Yeah, it's a structure built on insecurity and enforced by silence and shame.
And we meticulously traced the flow. External oppression is internalized, leading to measurable, devastating psychological damage, loneliness, depression, lower stability of self.
But we also saw the immense power of resilience, whether through individual coping mechanisms like sublimation or through intentional intervention strategies like affirmative therapy and purposeful intimate contact. The goal has to be to dismantle the external barriers while simultaneously promoting the internal strength needed for self-acceptance.
We started this conversation by discussing how authentic identity is often theorized as being born in the renunciation of societal expectations, rejecting the norms that define masculinity and family life.
Right.
Yet one of the most powerful and hopeful findings we covered today was the research out of Israel. The LGBT individuals who achieved highly traditional, socially validated milestones, specifically couplehood and parenthood, reported significantly lower internalized homonegativity and better overall mental health.
That is the powerful final tension we want to leave you with. If strong identity is often achieved by rejecting the norms, why did the profound power of achieving social validation and stability through traditional means, a partner and children, prove to be such a strong buffer against the internalized critic?
It suggests that the desire for stability, for belonging, for recognized achievement remains a fundamental human need.
It does, and it prompts us to consider what would happen if those traditional life goals, and indeed every possible life goal, were celebrated and validated for the LGBTQIA+ community without any compromise or underlying societal hostility. What does true, uncompromised social acceptance look like when you no longer need external achievement to quiet the internal critic, because the critic itself has starved for lack of external societal support?